In the quiet corners of the laboratory facility stood the cafeteria, a place where science met sustenance. The walls were unassuming, painted in calming tones, and the tables, though sterile in their arrangement, were inviting enough for weary researchers seeking refuge from their experiments. This was where I, an ordinary lab technician named Martin, spent most of my lunch breaks. The cafeteria was my sanctuary, a space where I could momentarily detach from the rigorous data sheets and microscopic analyses that constituted my daily routine. The cafeteria had always been a tranquil haven, a constant in the ever-changing landscape of scientific endeavor. My routine was reliably mundane. Each day, I would enter, grab a tray, and proceed to the buffet line. The food was standard, nothing extravagant, but sufficient to fuel the mind and body. A rotation of soups, salads, and sandwiches was serenaded by the occasional whir of the coffee machine. I never gave much thought to the food beyond its immediate purpose of satiation. It was on a nondescript Tuesday when the first disturbance occurred. I noticed something peculiar about the soup of the day. It was tomato-based, a perennial favorite, but on this day, it emitted a faint, unplaceable odor. It wasn't the sharpness of spoiled food, but more a whisper of something foreign, a scent that flitted at the edge of recognition and then vanished. I dismissed it as an anomaly, attributing it to a minor oversight in preparation. After all, the cafeteria staff were humans, prone to the same errors as the rest of us. As I sat at my usual table by the window, framed by the soft autumnal light, I mulled over my suspicions. My colleagues were scattered around, engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to the culinary oddity. Across from me, Dr. Emily Barnes happily slurped her soup, her expressions giving no indication of anything amiss. Her presence was reassuring. If there was truly something wrong, surely others would notice. I pushed the thought aside, concluding that my senses were merely playing tricks on me. However, the days that followed were marked by a growing disquiet. Each visit to the cafeteria brought with it a new subtlety and strangeness. The salads seemed overly crisp, their textures just slightly off, as if they had been constructed with more than just vegetables. The sandwiches had fillings that, despite their familiar appearance, left an unexpected metallic taste lingering on the tongue. I watched as my colleagues consumed these meals with the same oblivion as before, their conversations undisturbed and their laughter untainted by the sensation that gnawed at me. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and unease, I began to observe more closely. It was then I noticed the changes in the cafeteria staff. The once friendly cafeteria manager, Laura, had grown distant, her smile now perfunctory. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, seemed to flick over patrons with a nervous, almost hunted look. The kitchen staff, too, seemed to move with a precision that bordered on mechanical, their actions devoid of the usual chatter and camaraderie. I decided to conduct a small experiment of my own. On a particularly quiet afternoon, I lingered by the buffet longer than usual, watching the behavior of those who served. There was a peculiar rhythm to their movements, as if they were synchronized to an unseen metronome. I was drawn to a particular dish, a new addition to the menu, a stew with an aroma that was both enticing and unsettling. Its surface shimmered with a peculiar iridescence that defied the natural order of foodstuffs. I took a sample, ostensibly to taste, but in reality, I intended to analyze it later in the lab. As I departed, I caught a glimpse of Laura watching me, her expression inscrutable but laden with an intensity that suggested she knew more than she let on. Back in the lab, I conducted a series of tests on the stew. The results were baffling. The composition was unlike anything I had encountered before. The proteins were ordinary, yet they responded to stimuli in extraordinary ways, contracting and expanding as if alive. It was as if the food itself was a living entity, a sentient organism disguising itself as a meal. A chill settled in my bones, a realization dawning that this was no ordinary food. But what was it? And more importantly, what was its purpose? The following days spiraled into a crescendo of escalating terror. Each meal served in the cafeteria seemed to pulse with an energy, an unseen vitality that thrummed beneath the surface. I watched my colleagues consume it with increasing vigor, their eyes glazing with a contentment that seemed unnatural. It was as if they were under a spell, their wills subverted by whatever lurked within the cafeteria's offerings. I confronted Laura one evening as she was closing up. My voice, though calm, carried the weight of my suspicions. Laura, there's something wrong with the food. What is happening here? She hesitated, the mask of her composure slipping momentarily to reveal a flicker of fear. Martin, you shouldn't concern yourself with matters beyond your understanding. Just eat and be satisfied. But I can't, I insisted. There's something in the food. I need to know what it is. Laura sighed, her resolve crumbling. It's not what you think. It's necessary for the project. What project? I demanded, but she merely shook her head, retreating into silence. Left with more questions than answers, I realized that whatever was occurring in the cafeteria was connected to something larger, something that transcended the boundaries of our scientific endeavors. I delved into the facility's archives, scanning for clues that might illuminate the mystery. What I found was a project initiated months ago, cryptically titled Nourishment Evolution, led by an external team whose presence was largely unacknowledged. The project aimed to develop a new form of sustenance, one that could adapt and respond to the human body's needs in real time. The implications were staggering. A food source that was not only nourishing but dynamic, adjusting its composition to optimize human performance. But at what cost? What had they unleashed in their pursuit of advancement? My investigation was cut short by an urgent message summoning all personnel to the cafeteria. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of the new stew. As we gathered, the lead researcher, Dr. Henderson, addressed us with a calm demeanor that belied the gravity of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, you have been part of an experiment that holds the potential to revolutionize our understanding of nutrition. The food you have consumed these past weeks is part of an advanced symbiotic system designed to enhance human capability. His words hung in the air, a chilling confirmation of my worst fears. But there are risks, he continued, his tone sober. The system is still adapting, and there have been unintended consequences. We are working to mitigate these effects. A murmur of unrest rippled through the crowd, the spell of ignorance lifting to reveal the peril in which we stood. The food was no mere nourishment. It was an agent of change, a catalyst for an evolution we hadn't consented to. Panic festered beneath the surface, but we were trapped, bound by the unspoken understanding that leaving was not an option. The cafeteria, once a place of respite, had transformed into a theater of dread, its walls closing in with each passing moment. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within the facility became charged with a palpable tension. The food continued to beckon with an insidious allure, its unseen tendrils weaving through our consciousness, whispering promises of transformation. My colleagues, once vibrant and full of life, became lethargic, their eyes glassy with a serene detachment. It was as if they were slipping into another state of being, one dictated by the insidious nourishment they consumed. I resisted the pull, subsisting instead on rations I had secreted away, my mind a fortress against the creeping influence. I knew that to succumb would be to lose myself to whatever lay within the food's matrix, an existence not of my choosing, but of another's design. The climax came as a storm, sudden and unavoidable. It was a night when the facility was thrown into darkness, the power inexplicably failing as a tempest raged outside. The cafeteria was cast in shadow, the emergency lights flickering with a sinister glow. It was then that the food revealed its true nature. The once benign forms writhed on the platters, their surfaces pulsating with a life of their own. The stew, the soup, the salads, they moved with purpose, a unity of intent that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. My colleagues, drawn by an unseen force, approached the food with an alarming eagerness. Their movements were not their own, guided instead by the will of the entity that had taken root within them. I watched, helpless, as they consumed the writhing masses, their eyes alight with a fervor that was not of this world. In that moment, I understood the full scope of what had been unleashed. The food was not merely a sustenance, but a vessel for something far more malevolent, an intelligence that sought to merge with us, to become one with humanity in a symbiotic union. I fled the cafeteria, my mind reeling with the horror of what I had witnessed. The facility was no longer a sanctuary of science, but a crucible of transformation, its boundaries dissolving as the entity spread its influence. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide from the creeping dread that sought to claim us all. In the aftermath, the facility resumed its operations, but the air was thick with unspoken fear. The project continued, its purpose shrouded in secrecy, its ramifications yet to be fully understood. I remained vigilant, wary of the food that bore the seeds of change, aware that the unseen terror still lurked, waiting for the moment to reassert its control. The cafeteria was still a place of gathering, but its meals were now consumed with a quiet dread, each bite a reminder of the unseen forces at play. My colleagues carried on, their minds tethered to the project that had altered them, their lives forever changed by the choices made in pursuit of progress. I kept my distance, a lone observer in a world irrevocably altered. The fear lingered, a shadow that stretched beyond the physical confines of the facility, following me into each meal, each moment of solitude. It was a constant companion, a reminder of the unseen terror that had come to define our existence. As I sat alone, the autumn light filtering through the windows, I pondered the future that lay ahead, a future shaped by forces unseen and unknowable. The cafeteria, once a symbol of normalcy, had become a threshold to a new reality, a reality in which the boundaries between humanity and the unknown were blurred, leaving us to navigate the shadows that loomed ever closer. The cafeteria was one of those places that existed in a strange limbo between function and forgettable architecture. No one ever went there for the ambience. It was tucked away in the corner of the sprawling laboratory facility, a sterile temple to efficiency where scientists, researchers, and various staff members gathered to refuel and briefly escape the demands of their meticulous work. The walls were painted a nondescript shade of off-white, and the tables wore the constant slick sheen of disinfectant. During lunch hours, the room filled with the low hum of conversations, punctuated by the clatter of metal cutlery against porcelain plates. I remember the first time I set foot in the cafeteria with a vague sense of nostalgia. It was a place that hadn't changed much over the years. The same pale fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a slightly cold hue that seemed to leach warmth from both food and people. Still, it was comforting in its predictability, a small corner of routine in a world that often felt chaotic. As with every day, I stood in line, my tray gliding smoothly along the stainless steel rail as I surveyed the day's offerings. There was the usual selection, a few indifferent cold cuts, some wilted lettuce masquerading as a salad, and the daily special, a nondescript stew that seemed to feature prominently regardless of the season. It was institutional food at its finest, designed more to nourish than to delight. Yet, it was on this ordinary day that the first disturbance came, unremarkable at first, like a whisper on the edge of perception. I noticed it as I took my seat at one of the long communal tables. The stew, which I had chosen more out of habit than enthusiasm, seemed different. It wasn't the taste, necessarily. Those were as bland and utilitarian as ever, but there was something about the texture, a faint grittiness that clung to the back of my throat, leaving a residue of unease long after I'd swallowed. Perhaps it was just my imagination, I told myself. The mind often plays tricks, especially after a long morning of peering through microscopes and deciphering charts. With an absent-minded shrug, I dismissed the sensation as a one-time oddity and returned to the comforting rhythm of my routine. But as the days unfurled, the disturbances grew harder to ignore. The stew was a constant, as if it had become the sole focus of the cafeteria's culinary repertoire. Each day, it was slightly different, a shifting palette of unspecific flavors and textures that defied easy categorization. There was an almost experimental quality to it, a sense that someone, somewhere, was using us as unwitting participants in a gastronomic trial. Conversations around the table shifted, too. Colleagues who once spoke animatedly of experiments and results now exchanged furtive glances over their meals. Lines like, "Have you noticed?" and "Does it taste?" peppered our discussions, always trailing into hesitant silence, as if voicing such suspicions might somehow summon something we couldn't see. It was during one such lunch that the atmosphere changed from mere unease to palpable tension. A young researcher named Eliza sat across from me, her fork hovering uncertainly above her plate. Her usual vivacity was replaced by a pallor that made her eyes seem larger, more haunted. "There's something wrong with the food," she said suddenly, her voice low and urgent. "I mean, really wrong." I glanced at her plate, a mirror of mine, the stew sitting there innocuously. "What do you mean?" I asked, the skepticism in my voice barely masked. Eliza leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been looking into it, analyzing it when I can. There are anomalies, things that shouldn't be there." Her words sent a chill through me, one I couldn't easily dismiss. "What kind of anomalies?" I asked, my own voice now matching her conspiratorial tone. "Traces of something biological, unidentifiable. It's not just food, it's alive." A nervous laugh bubbled up from someone at the end of our table, but it quickly died in the oppressive silence. The word alive lingered, an echo that seemed to reverberate through the cafeteria. It was ridiculous, of course. Food was supposed to sustain life, not embody it. Yet, if there was one thing I had learned from years of scientific inquiry, it was that the boundary between possibility and impossibility was often paper thin, subject to the whims of discovery, and that realization filled me with a deep-seated dread. The next few days brought an escalation that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. People fell ill, their symptoms varying wildly: headaches, nausea, inexplicable fatigue. The facility's infirmary became a revolving door of patients, yet no one could pinpoint the cause. The stew remained, unyielding in its presence, its ingredients a closely guarded secret of the cafeteria staff. I began to eat less, an instinctive recoil from something I couldn't define. My colleagues did the same, our meals reduced to hushed, cautious affairs. Yet the stew was always there, always waiting, as if daring us to uncover its secrets. It was a week later when everything came to a head. The cafeteria was crowded, the air thick with a tension that felt almost tangible. I watched as Eliza entered, her face set with a determination I hadn't seen before. She carried with her a small vial, the contents swirling darkly within. "I tested it," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of the room. "This is what's in the stew." People turned to look, curiosity mingling with unease. She placed the vial at the center of our table, its presence as unsettling as her words. "It's a culture," she continued, "a living organism. It replicates, adapts, it feeds." The revelation was a bombshell, detonating the fragile calm we had maintained. Conversations erupted into chaos, accusations flying as trust collapsed under the weight of fear. Was it a contamination? A deliberate experiment gone wrong? Or something else entirely? I watched the scene unfold, a sense of helplessness clawing at me. The cafeteria, once a sanctuary of normalcy, had become a theater of the absurd, the invisible horror of consumption laid bare. Yet, amid the panic, a realization dawned that chilled me to the core. The stew was still being served. Even as we grappled with the implications of Eliza's discovery, trays continued to slide along the rail, bowls being filled with the same inscrutable concoction. Eliza's voice rose above the din, a rallying cry to action. "We have to stop eating it, all of us." Her words, though simple, carried the weight of truth. Yet, they also revealed a deeper, more insidious fear. What if it was already too late? In the days that followed, the cafeteria became a ghost town. People avoided it, opting for hastily packed lunches or vending machine snacks. Yet the stew remained, each bowl a silent testament to the unseen terror that had taken root among us. The laboratory facility, once a beacon of scientific progress, now felt like a mausoleum of unanswered questions. The fear lingered, stubbornly resistant to time or reason. Even as weeks passed and no further illness was reported, the dread persisted, a shadow that clung to us like a second skin. I found myself avoiding the cafeteria altogether, The memories it held too potent, too raw. But sometimes, late at night when the building was quiet and empty, I'd wander through the darkened corridors, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion. I'd stand at the entrance, peering into the dimly lit interior, half expecting to see the stew bubbling malevolently in its metal container, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting victim. The cafeteria became a part of our shared folklore, a cautionary tale of curiosity and consequence. We spoke of it in hushed tones, a reminder of the thin veneer of normalcy that could so easily be shattered. And though the stew was eventually replaced by more conventional fare, the fear endured, an indelible mark on our collective psyche. It was a testament to the unseen terror of consumption, the dread of what lay beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It lingered in our thoughts, a quiet voice whispering of the unknown, reminding us that some mysteries were best left undisturbed. The day began like any other with the gentle hum of fluorescent lights flickering on in the laboratory facility's cafeteria. I had grown used to the sterile aura of the place, the white walls and polished steel tables that gleamed under the artificial glow. The cafeteria was a sanctuary in the midst of our demanding work schedule, a place where one could escape the relentless beep of monitors and the overbearing presence of formulas scribbled on whiteboards. It was a predictable corner of the world, where the most exciting event was the rotating menu that featured a surprisingly decent chicken salad every Wednesday. I liked sitting by the window, though the view wasn't much, a strip of sky peeking above the upper floors of nearby buildings. Still, it was a slice of the outside world that grounded me amidst the daily grind of research and experimentation. Colleagues filtered in and out, their faces familiar, their conversations a comforting background buzz. We were a close-knit community, bound by our shared endeavors and our unspoken understanding of the pressures we faced. One day, a subtle shift in this routine caught my attention. It was during lunchtime, a time when the cafeteria was typically filled with the clatter of cutlery and the soft murmur of chatter. I noticed, almost immediately, the presence of an unfamiliar item on the buffet, a dish that I couldn't quite place. It was nestled among the usual fare, its appearance nondescript yet somehow compelling. It looked like a stew, thick and aromatic, the steam wafting off in tendrils that curled invitingly in the air. Curiosity piqued. I approached the counter, plate in hand. The cafeteria staff, a genial woman named Linda, smiled as she ladled a portion onto my plate. "New recipe," she said, her voice holding a hint of pride. "Just came in today." The stew was brown, rich with chunks of indistinguishable meat and vegetables. It smelled of spices, something foreign and exotic that stirred a vague sense of nostalgia, the kind that teases the edges of memory. I thanked Linda and returned to my table, eager to try this new addition. As I took the first bite, I noticed something odd. It tasted familiar and yet elusive, like a fragment of a dream slipping away upon waking. The flavors danced on my tongue, a blend of savory and sweet that was both comforting and disconcerting. I couldn't quite place it, and yet I was drawn in, compelled to take another bite. By the end of the meal, I felt a strange satisfaction mingled with an inexplicable unease. The stew lingered in my thoughts long after I left the cafeteria and returned to my work. It was as though the very act of consuming it had awakened something dormant inside me, a whisper of a memory not yet fully remembered. Days passed, and the stew became a regular fixture on the menu, quickly earning a following among the staff. It wasn't long before I began to notice subtle changes in my colleagues. They seemed to move with a slight lethargy, a dreamy quality to their actions that was at odds with the high-paced environment of the laboratory. Conversations grew more abstract, filled with half-formed thoughts and sentences that trailed off into silence. At first, I dismissed it as the product of fatigue. We were all working long hours, after all, and the pressure of deadlines was an ever-present weight. Yet, as the week progressed, the sense of unease grew. It clung to the air like a mist, wrapping around our shared spaces, making every interaction feel surreal and distanced. On a particularly fog-infused morning, I overheard two colleagues whispering in hushed tones by the coffee machine. Their words were fragmented, slipping in and out of coherence, but one phrase stood out to me. "It feels like a dream." A dream. The words echoed in my mind, resonating with the vague unease that had settled over us. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play, something beyond the normal ebb and flow of stress-induced fatigue. Driven by a growing sense of dread, I decided to investigate further. That evening, after the cafeteria had closed and the staff had gone home, I returned with a key borrowed under the pretense of needing to retrieve a forgotten item. The cafeteria was dark, the shadows deep and pervasive, but I felt compelled to enter, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain. I approached the serving station, the memory of the stew's aroma still vivid in my mind. The kitchen beyond was silent, an ordinary scene of stainless steel and pristine surfaces. Yet, there was a presence in the air, an almost tangible energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. In the cool confines of the refrigerator, I found a pot of the stew, its contents congealed and cold. I carefully lifted the lid, peering inside at the glistening surface, searching for something, anything, that might explain the growing sense of unease. And then I saw it. It was a faint shimmer, a ripple that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of the stew, as though something unseen was breathing, alive and aware. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest, the air suddenly thick and oppressive. Driven by an instinct I couldn't comprehend, I took a sample, sealing it carefully in a sterile container. I needed to know what lay beneath the surface, what it was that had infiltrated our safe, mundane world. Back in the lab, I set to work, analyzing the sample with a meticulous precision honed by years of experience. As the results began to form, my unease deepened into dread. The stew contained compounds I had never encountered before, complex structures that defied classification, their origins unknown and unsettling. It was then that I noticed the presence of an enzyme, its signature identical to a compound I had seen only once before, buried in a classified report from a previous research project. It had been described as a neurochemical enhancer, an agent capable of altering perception and consciousness. The implications were staggering. It was as though the very food we consumed was a conduit, a medium through which our minds were subtly, inexorably altered. The idea was terrifying in its simplicity, a creeping horror that seeped into every aspect of our lives. I tried to warn my colleagues, but my words were met with blank stares and vague assurances. It was as though they were cocooned in a fog, their thoughts dulled and distant, unreachable. Desperation gnawed at the edges of my sanity, urging me to act, to find a way to break the spell that had ensnared us all. I spent my nights poring over data, seeking answers in the labyrinthine corridors of research and science. In the end, it was a simple observation that led to a breakthrough. The compound in the stew was activated by heat, its properties neutralized when exposed to cold. I devised a plan, one last desperate attempt to reclaim our minds and our lives. The following morning, I arrived early, before the first shift of staff. I adjusted the cafeteria's thermostat, plunging the room into a chill that sent shivers through my bones. It was a gamble, a final stand against the unseen terror that lingered in the air. When my colleagues arrived, they hesitated at the threshold, their movements sluggish and confused. The cold seemed to pierce the fog that clouded their minds, bringing clarity and awareness. Slowly, they turned their eyes towards me, questions forming in their expressions. I explained as best I could, my words tumbling out in a rush as I outlined the strange journey we had unwittingly embarked upon. It was difficult to comprehend, but as the morning wore on and the cold maintained its grip, their minds began to clear. It was as though waking from a deep slumber, the world suddenly sharp and vivid once more. We disposed of the stew, every last trace of it poured down the drain, washed away in a torrent of scalding water. The cafeteria returned to normal, its mundane predictability a welcome balm to our frayed nerves. Yet, even as we resumed our routines, a lingering fear remained, a whisper of doubt that haunted our thoughts. We had been altered, our perceptions twisted by something we had unknowingly consumed. The experience left a scar, an indelible mark on our psyche that no amount of rational explanation could erase. In the weeks that followed, the cafeteria became a place of caution, every meal scrutinized, every dish met with suspicion. We couldn't shake the feeling that something had slipped through the cracks, a shadow lurking at the edge of our reality, waiting for the right moment to return. The memory of the stew and its insidious influence lingered, a reminder that even in the safest of places, the greatest horrors could find their way in. And as I sat by the window, staring out at the strip of sky beyond, I couldn't help but wonder if we had truly escaped, or if we were merely biding our time until the next unseen terror arrived. I remember the cafeteria of the research facility as an innocuous place, a space that seemed to exist outside the sterile corridors of the laboratories where I spent most of my days. It was a refuge of sorts, a bright spot in the otherwise pale routine of research work. The linoleum floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, tables were lined in neat rows, and the smell of coffee, always present, filled the air with a comforting aroma. The large windows offered a view of the surrounding forest, a reminder of the world beyond the endless cycles of experiments and data analysis. It was a place of normalcy, where the mundane ritual of selecting food from the cafeteria line provided a break from the relentless pursuit of scientific discovery. I had worked at the facility for just over 4 years, and in that time, the cafeteria had become a predictable part of my daily life. The food was unremarkable but adequate, a collection of packaged sandwiches, salads, and hot entrees that changed depending on the day of the week. The staff behind the counter, uniformed in white smocks, were amiable, though distant, performing their tasks with mechanical efficiency. We exchanged pleasantries, but I never learned their names, nor they mine. It was on a Tuesday that I first noticed something was amiss. The morning had begun like any other. I arrived at my lab, reviewed my notes, and prepared to continue my work. As lunchtime approached, I made my way to the cafeteria, expecting the usual fare. However, as I stepped inside, there was an imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. The cafeteria appeared unchanged at first glance, but there was a subtle, unsettling difference in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite place. The other researchers seemed oblivious, moving through the line with their usual practiced ease, selecting their meals and taking seats at the tables. I joined the line and picked up a tray, but as I approached the food counter, hesitation gripped me. The selection was different. Instead of the typical offerings, there were dishes I didn't recognize, arranged in an artful display. Vibrantly colored salads, steaming bowls of soup, and entrees that looked almost too perfect. The staff behind the counter seemed the same, but their smiles were strained, and their eyes held an intensity that made me uneasy. I chose a modest salad and a bowl of soup, reasoning that I was simply overthinking things. Perhaps the facility had decided to improve the menu. It wasn't unheard of. Yet, as I sat down to eat, that feeling of discomfort lingered, an intangible weight pressing on my shoulders. The food tasted extraordinary, far better than anything I had ever had there before. Each bite was an explosion of flavor, a decadent experience that seemed to envelop the senses. I finished my meal with an unsettling sense of satisfaction, my unease buried under the pleasure of the meal. The rest of the day passed without incident, but as I left the facility, a gnawing feeling lingered at the edge of my consciousness. The following days saw the cafeteria menu continue to evolve. More exotic dishes appeared, each more sumptuous than the last. Colleagues spoke in hushed tones about the change, sharing theories and rumors. Some speculated that a new chef had been hired, while others thought it was a marketing ploy to boost morale. I tried to dismiss it as a harmless change, yet I found myself increasingly drawn to the cafeteria, ensnared by the allure of the food. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the cafeteria had taken on a life of its own. The conversations amongst the researchers became less about work and more about the meals, each one more incredible than the last. The feeling of discomfort I had initially experienced had grown into a dull roar in my mind, an alarm that refused to be silenced. It was during one of these meals, as I sat alone at a table near the window, that I noticed something truly strange. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the cafeteria floor. The light shifted, and as it did, the reflection in the window seemed to flicker. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light. But there it was again, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, an outline that didn't belong. Against the backdrop of the forest, there was a figure, a tall, indistinct silhouette that hovered at the edge of the tree line. It was watching, I realized with a cold shiver down my spine. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone outside, but all I saw were the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The reflection returned to normal, and I tried to shake off the eerie sensation, but deep down, I knew that something was not right. The unseen presence, whether real or imagined, seemed connected to the changes in the cafeteria. An unseen terror lurking at the fringes of my perception, feeding my growing dread. The weekend offered little relief. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and endless rows of glistening, inedible food. I awoke each morning with a sense of foreboding. The events of the past week were replaying in my mind. I knew I had to discover the truth to understand what was happening. And so, with a sense of grim determination, I resolved to investigate. Monday arrived, and with it, a renewed sense of resolve. I returned to the cafeteria, determined to uncover the mystery that lay hidden within its walls. The food was as enticing as ever, but I ignored its siren call, focusing instead on the staff behind the counter. Their expressions were unchanged, but their movements seemed more deliberate, as if they were silently communicating amongst themselves. I watched them, searching for any clue, any sign of what lay beneath the surface. It was then that I noticed the door. Tucked away at the back of the kitchen, it was barely visible, obscured by the large, industrial appliances. My heart raced as I realized it was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning to me. I waited until the cafeteria was nearly empty, and then, under the guise of returning my tray, I made my way into the kitchen. The door led to a narrow hallway, dimly lit with flickering fluorescent bulbs. The air was thick with an unfamiliar smell, a blend of spices and something else, something that made my skin crawl. I moved slowly, conscious of every creak and groan of the floor beneath my feet. The hallway opened into a larger room, stark and utilitarian, filled with stainless steel tables and shelves lined with ingredients. At first, it seemed like an ordinary kitchen, but as I examined the room more closely, I realized there was something off about it. The ingredients were unfamiliar, each one labeled with cryptic symbols rather than names. Jars of powders and herbs, their contents a mystery, lined the shelves. And then I saw it, the source of the smell. It was a large cauldron set in the center of the room, filled with a thick, bubbling concoction. The liquid was a deep, unnatural shade, and as I approached, I could feel the heat radiating from it. The aroma was intoxicating, a heady mix that made my mind spin. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around me, the walls bending and shifting as if alive. Panic surged through me, and I staggered back, desperate to escape. I turned and ran, the hallway a blur as I fled the kitchen. Out in the cafeteria, I struggled to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had stumbled upon something beyond my understanding, a secret that defied explanation. Yet, as I looked around, I realized that no one else seemed to notice. The other researchers continued their meals, oblivious to the horror that lay hidden just beyond the kitchen door. That night, sleep eluded me once more, my mind haunted by visions of the cauldron and the shadows beyond the window. I lay awake, my thoughts churning, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the more I tried to understand, the more elusive the answers became. The following day, I returned to the cafeteria, driven by a morbid curiosity. I avoided the food, instead focusing on the people around me. I watched as my colleagues ate, noting the glazed look in their eyes, the way they seemed to drift through conversations without truly engaging. It was as if they were under a spell, ensnared by the same unseen force that had drawn me into the kitchen. And then I saw her, a woman I recognized from the lab, sitting alone in the corner. Her plate was untouched, her eyes distant and unfocused. I approached her, compelled by a need to connect with someone who might feel as I did, someone who might see the truth. "Do you feel it too?" I asked quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked up at me, her expression shifting as if waking from a dream. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "Something is wrong here. I can't explain it, but I know it's real." Together, We shared our experiences, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. She had seen the figure in the woods too, and like me, she had sensed the change in the cafeteria, an underlying menace hidden beneath the surface. Over the next few days, we continued our investigation, searching for any information that might explain what was happening. We pored over personnel records, trying to uncover the identities of the cafeteria staff. But the records were incomplete, the names and photos missing or obscured by bureaucratic red tape. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase their existence. Our search for answers led us to the facility's archives, a dusty collection of documents and files that chronicled the history of the research center. We spent hours sifting through the records, driven by desperation and a growing sense of urgency. It was there that we found it, a reference to an experimental project, long since abandoned, that had sought to harness the mind's perception of taste and aroma. The project had been deemed a failure, its findings inconclusive. Yet, as we read through the documents, it became clear that something had survived, a remnant of the research that had taken on a life of its own. Armed with this knowledge, we returned to the cafeteria, determined to confront the staff and uncover the truth. But as we entered the kitchen, we found it empty, the cauldron cold and lifeless. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. In the days that followed, the cafeteria returned to its previous state, the exotic dishes replaced by the familiar, mundane offerings we had known before. The sense of unease lingered, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. My colleagues, unaware of the events that had transpired, resumed their routines, the memory of the strange days fading like a dream upon waking. But for me, the fear never truly left. It lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a reminder of the unseen terror that had brushed against my life. The memory of that shadowy figure, of the cauldron and its mysterious contents, haunted me. I knew that the danger had not disappeared, merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. Even now, as I sit in the cafeteria, I find myself glancing towards the windows, searching for any sign of movement in the trees beyond. The fear, once a dull whisper, has become a constant companion, a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some truths are too terrifying to comprehend. The cafeteria, nestled within the sprawling labyrinth of the laboratory facility, was a place of solace and routine. Each morning, scientists, researchers, and staff convened here, drawn by the promise of coffee and conversation. The room was painted a sterile white, its walls adorned with notice boards filled with memos and reminders of protocols. It was a place where the cacophony of clinking cutlery and the murmur of subdued chatter created a comforting backdrop against the exacting silence of the labs. I had been working at the facility for 3 years, my days marked by the steady rhythm of research and deadlines. The cafeteria was a fixture in my routine, a place where I could momentarily escape the pressures of work and indulge in the simple pleasure of a warm meal. The food was unremarkable yet consistent, a buffet of choices that catered to the diverse tastes of those who frequented the space. It was here that I first noticed the disturbance, though at the time, it felt more like an unsettling whisper rather than a prelude to horror. It started on an ordinary Tuesday, the sort of day that skirts the boundaries of memory. I had arrived later than usual, caught up in a particularly engrossing sequence of experiments. By the time I entered the cafeteria, the lunch rush had dwindled. Only a few scattered souls remained, their voices low and indistinct. I moved toward the buffet, selecting my usual fare, a modest salad, a slice of bread, a cup of tea. As I settled into one of the tables near the window, I noticed an unfamiliar smell weaving through the air. It was an odd scent, faintly sweet yet cloying, a smell that seemed to belong more to a confectioner's shop than a sterile cafeteria. I glanced around, searching for its source. My colleagues appeared unfazed, engrossed in conversation or the screens of their devices. Shrugging off the sensation, I returned to my meal, attributing the scent to an overactive imagination. Days passed, and the scent persisted, a lingering presence that grew harder to ignore. It seemed to seep into the fabric of the cafeteria, soaking into the walls and floors. I found myself distracted by it, my concentration in the laboratory fraying at the edges. I confided in Daniel, a biochemist who had become a close friend during my time at the facility. Over lunch, I mentioned the scent, hoping he might offer some rational explanation. "You're imagining things," he said, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand. "The cafeteria's always had its smells. Probably something being cooked up in the kitchen." His words, though intended to comfort, left me feeling more unsettled. I tried to ignore the scent, to push it to the recesses of my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. It was around this time that the rumors began to circulate, whispered in hushed tones over lunch and coffee breaks. People spoke of a series of strange occurrences, a growing number of employees reporting nausea, an inexplicable fatigue that seemed to drain them of energy. No one could pinpoint the cause, and the administration remained tight-lipped. The escalation was gradual, almost insidious in its progression. The cafeteria, once a place of comfort, had become fraught with tension. People spoke in lowered voices, their expressions marked by a shared confusion. The scent, to my dismay, had grown stronger, a sweet and sickly perfume that seemed to intensify with each passing day. I found myself dreading my visits to the cafeteria, my sense of unease deepening with each encounter. One afternoon, as I sat alone at a corner table, I noticed a peculiar sight. A bowl of fruit, nestled among the standard offerings, appeared untouched, its contents unnaturally vibrant. The apples glistened with an unnatural sheen, the oranges almost luminous in their hue. It was as if the fruit had been plucked from a dream, a mirage of abundance. I watched as one of the lab assistants, a young man named Michael, approached the fruit, his curiosity piqued. He reached for an apple, his fingers wrapping around its perfect form. As he bit into it, a look of surprise flickered across his face, replaced swiftly by confusion. He set the fruit down, half eaten, and returned to his seat. Minutes later, he excused himself, a hand pressed to his stomach, his face pale. The incident, though small, seemed to mark a turning point. Others whispered of similar experiences, of food that tasted too sweet, too rich, of an aftertaste that lingered long after the meal had ended. The administration, perhaps sensing the growing unrest, announced an investigation, promising to identify and resolve the issue. Yet, days turned into weeks, and the investigation yielded no answers. I found myself drawn into the web of mystery, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The scent had become a constant companion, invading my thoughts, my dreams. I began to perceive it as a living thing, a presence that lurked at the edge of perception. It was during one of these restless nights that I made the decision to act, to uncover the truth behind the cafeteria's transformation. The facility, like most of its kind, was governed by strict security protocols. Access to certain areas was restricted, monitored by a network of cameras and checkpoints. But the cafeteria, a seemingly benign space, was an exception. After hours, it lay empty, the lights dimmed to a soft glow. It was here that I planned my investigation, determined to unravel the mystery that had ensnared us all. I arrived under the cover of darkness, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. The cafeteria was eerie in its silence, the absence of life amplifying every creak and sigh of the building. I moved quietly, my footsteps muffled against the linoleum floor. As I approached the buffet, I was struck by how different it appeared in the muted light, the shadows casting strange shapes across its surface. I focused my attention on the fruit, the bowl of impossible colors that had first captured my attention. It lay untouched, as if waiting. I hesitated, the memory of Michael's reaction flashing through my mind. Yet, driven by a compulsion I could not name, I reached for an apple, its skin cool and smooth against my palm. Holding it to my nose, I breathed in, seeking the source of the scent that haunted me. For a moment, I smelled nothing. And then, a sweetness, overpowering and artificial, flooded my senses. It was the scent that had permeated the cafeteria, yet magnified tenfold, a cloying aroma that seemed to coil around my thoughts. I dropped the apple, the fruit tumbling to the floor with a muted thud. As I bent to retrieve it, I caught sight of a movement, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I turned, my pulse quickening, but the room was empty, the shadows undisturbed. Shaking, I returned my gaze to the apple, now resting on the linoleum. An unsettling thought took root in my mind, a suspicion that the fruit, this seemingly innocuous offering, was at the heart of our needs. Determined to test my hypothesis, I retrieved a sample, carefully wrapping it in a sterile cloth. I would analyze it in the lab, draw upon my knowledge in search of a rational explanation. Yet, as I straightened and prepared to leave, the room shifted around me. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the air thickening with a palpable tension. My heart raced, a primal fear rising within me. The scent, that cloying, sickly sweet scent, seemed to swell, filling the cafeteria, pressing down upon me. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving me shaken and disoriented. I forced myself to move, to escape the confines of the room, my mind spinning with possibilities. The fruit, I was certain, held the key, a catalyst for the unseen terror that lingered in our midst. Back in the lab, I subjected the apple to a series of tests, my fingers moving with practiced precision. Hours slipped by as I worked, the results unfolding with a gradual clarity that brought no comfort. The fruit was unlike anything I had encountered, its composition altered by an unknown process, a manipulation that defied natural law. The implications were staggering, the questions it raised without answers. Who had introduced the fruit to the facility, and to what end? I considered the possibility of sabotage, of an experiment gone awry, but the truth eluded me, a specter at the edge of understanding. I shared my findings with Daniel, his expression darkening as he absorbed the information. "We need to report this," he said, his voice low. "The administration needs to know." Reluctantly, I agreed, though a part of me hesitated, wary of the unknown forces at play. Together, we compiled a report, the weight of our discovery heavy upon us. Yet, as the days passed with no response, my unease deepened. The cafeteria remained open, the fruit a continued presence, and the scent, that insidious perfume, persisted. The climax came unexpectedly, a crescendo of realization that shattered the fragile veneer of normalcy. I was in the lab, reviewing data, when a message arrived from Daniel. His words were terse, urgent, a request to meet in the cafeteria to discuss a new development. I found him seated at our usual table, a strange stillness in his demeanor. As I approached, he gestured for me to sit, his gaze fixed on the untouched plate before him. "I found something," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He explained in hushed tones, outlining his discovery, a connection between the fruit and a series of classified projects, experiments that blurred the line between science and something far darker. The implications were unsettling, the suggestion of an intent that went beyond mere negligence. As he spoke, a chill crept through me, a realization that we had stumbled upon a truth that should have remained hidden. The cafeteria, with its innocuous facade, was a stage for an unseen drama, a manipulation that ensnared us all. "We need to leave," I said, urgency threading my words. "This is bigger than us." But as I rose, the room shifted once more, a vertigo that left me reeling. The scent, that suffocating sweetness, enveloped us, a tangible force that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Around us, the cafeteria blurred, the walls distorting, as if the room itself were alive. Grasping Daniel's arm, I pulled him toward the exit, our steps faltering as the world twisted around us. The scent intensified, clinging to us like a second skin, a reminder of the unseen terror that had ensnared us. We reached the corridor, the door swinging shut behind us with a finality that echoed in the silence. Breathing heavily, we moved away, the weight of our discovery a burden we could not shed. The days that followed were marked by a lingering fear, a sense of vulnerability that shadowed our every step. The administration, alerted to the danger, took action. The cafeteria shuttered, its doors sealed. Yet the scent, that phantom of sweetness, remained in my memory, a reminder of the thin line that separates the known from the unknown. In the quiet of the laboratory, I often found my thoughts returning to those shadowed walls, the questions unanswered, the mystery unresolved. The cafeteria, with its sterile facade, had held a secret, a truth that whispered in the silence, a terror unseen yet profoundly felt. And so, I continued my work, the mundane rhythms of research offering a semblance of normalcy. Yet, beneath it all, the dread lingered, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are those we cannot see, the horrors that dwell just beyond the edge of understanding. It was a regular Tuesday morning at the laboratory facility, and I found myself, as always, drawn to the cafeteria. We scientists are creatures of habit, and the routine of my mornings was something I cherished. The cafeteria was a small, unassuming room tucked away in the basement of the building, away from the bustling activity of the research floors above. It was a haven of quietude, where the soft hum of the refrigerators provided a comforting soundtrack to the start of my day. The cafeteria was furnished with simple tables and chairs, their surfaces just beginning to show signs of wear, the occasional scratch or coffee ring on the wooden veneer evidence of countless conversations and solitary meals. The walls were painted a soft, nondescript beige, adorned with a few motivational posters that had long since faded into the background. Despite its modest appearance, the cafeteria was a vital part of the facility's ecosystem, a place where ideas were exchanged and minds recharged. As I sipped my coffee, I watched my colleagues trickle in, each one greeted by the familiar clatter of trays and the warm smell of breakfast. There was a comforting predictability to it all that I found reassuring. I glanced at the clock, noting it was nearly time for the morning briefing. The room filled gradually, the low murmur of conversation rising like steam from our mugs. This sense of normalcy, however, was about to be disrupted. It began with something small, an almost imperceptible shift that only those attuned to the rhythm of the place might notice. The first disturbance came that very morning, and it was as innocuous as a fly landing on the rim of a sugar bowl. In hindsight, I realized it was strange I took note of it at all. Someone had left an apple on a table, a perfectly ordinary thing to do in a cafeteria, but the way it sat there, gleaming dully under the fluorescent lights, struck me as odd. There was something about its placement, the deliberate tilt, as if it had been set down with intention rather than carelessness. I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, my mind wandering. The apple seemed to command my attention, drawing my focus away from the conversation around me. Eventually, I shook my head, dismissing my fixation as nothing more than a quirk of the morning brain fog. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the sense of unease grew, subtly at first, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. It was in the details, the way the food tasted slightly off, the texture not quite right. The bread seemed staler, the fruit less sweet. The cafeteria had always boasted a decent menu, nothing gourmet but certainly acceptable. Now, however, each bite left an aftertaste that lingered, a bitterness that I couldn't quite place. My colleagues began to notice it too. At first, it was just puzzled expressions and quiet comments exchanged over half-eaten sandwiches. "Does this taste different to you?" someone would ask, and invariably, the answer was yes. Yes, it did taste different, and not in a way that anyone could describe. It was a collective shrug of confusion, a shared mystery that settled over us like a fog. As the days wore on, the conversation began to change. People became more vocal about their concerns. The food's odd flavor was no longer ignored, and theories were bandied about like marbles, clattering and bouncing off the walls of our collective minds. Some suggested a change in suppliers, while others speculated about subtle cost-cutting measures. The more imaginative among us whispered half-jokingly about experiments gone wrong, about chemicals seeping into our meals from the depths of the research labs above. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, something beyond a mere change in suppliers or an off batch of produce. There was a sense of something lurking just beyond the periphery of our understanding, a shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. The escalation was gradual yet inexorable. More and more of us began to avoid the cafeteria, opting instead to bring meals from home. For those who remained, the act of eating became an exercise in paranoia. I watched my colleagues as they eyed their plates with suspicion, each forkful lifted with trepidation. I found myself doing the same, and my enjoyment of the once comforting ritual of morning coffee was tainted by an unnameable dread. The turning point came one afternoon when I sat alone at a corner table, a half-eaten sandwich in front of me. The room was almost empty, the usual hustle and bustle reduced to a handful of weary souls scattered among the tables. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. It was then that I noticed something truly unsettling. The apple, or an apple identical to the one I had seen days earlier, was back on the table. It was in the exact same spot, with the same peculiar tilt. I rose from my seat, compelled to inspect it more closely. As I approached, a wave of nausea washed over me, an instinctive reaction that defied logic. I stopped short, my heart pounding in my chest. The apple seemed to pulse, as if in sync with the thudding in my ears. A part of me wanted to reach out, to touch it, to reassure myself that it was nothing more than a piece of fruit, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was a primal part of my mind screaming at me to leave it alone, to stay away. I turned and left the cafeteria, my appetite forgotten, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. In the following days, the atmosphere in the laboratory shifted from one of quiet concern to overt anxiety. Fewer people visited the cafeteria, and those who did emerged with pale faces and tight-lipped expressions. Theories continued to circulate, each one more outlandish than the last, but none offered the comfort of truth. The climax of this unnerving saga arrived one morning when the cafeteria was all but deserted. Only a handful of us remained, either too stubborn or too resigned to avoid the place altogether. As I sat at my usual table, a colleague, Dr. Rice, approached me with a grim expression on his face. "Have you noticed?" he asked, his voice low, as if he feared being overheard. "Noticed what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The apple," he said, nodding towards the table where it always appeared. "It's there every day, always the same. And, and it's not just that." I followed his gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. The apple was there, but now there were others. A banana, a cluster of grapes, all arranged with the same deliberate care, each one gleaming with a waxy sheen that seemed almost unnatural. "What do you think it means?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Dr. Rice shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have a theory." He hesitated, glancing around the room to ensure no one else was listening. "What if it's not just food? What if it's something else? Something alive?" His words sent a shiver through me, a feeling of creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. It was a thought I hadn't dared to entertain, yet now that it was spoken, I couldn't dismiss it. "What do you suggest we do?" I asked, my mind racing. "We need to test it," he said. "We need to find out what's really going on." That evening, after the last of our colleagues had departed, Dr. Rice and I returned to the cafeteria. Armed with gloves and sampling equipment, we approached the table with our hearts in our throats. The apple, the banana, the grapes, they all sat there, as if mocking our fear, daring us to uncover their secret. We took samples, careful not to disturb the arrangement more than necessary. As we worked, the oppressive silence of the room seemed to close in around us, the hum of the refrigerators now a menacing drone. We retreated to the safety of the laboratory, eager to analyze the samples and uncover the truth. The results were inconclusive, yet deeply unsettling. The samples showed no signs of contamination, no foreign substances or unusual compounds. And yet, they were undeniably different, their cellular structure altered in ways we couldn't explain. It was as if they were imbued with a life of their own, a sentience that defied all scientific understanding. In the days that followed, the samples seemed to deteriorate rapidly, their surfaces bruising and decaying at an accelerated rate. It was as if they were dying, withering away now that they were separated from the cafeteria's strange influence. Though we never spoke of it to anyone else, the fear remained. Dr. Rice and I stopped visiting the cafeteria altogether, choosing instead to eat in the privacy of our offices. The mystery of the cafeteria lingered in our minds, a haunting reminder of the unseen terror that lurked within those walls. The cafeteria remained open, though it was a shadow of its former self. Few ventured inside, and those who did spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flickering with a nervous energy. The apple, the fruit, the sense of something otherworldly, they were all part of a secret that none of us could escape. In time, the laboratory moved on, the mystery of the cafeteria fading into the background of our collective memory. But for those of us who had been there, who had witnessed the strange happenings firsthand, the fear never truly left. It lingered in the corners of our minds, an unseen presence that haunted our thoughts. And so, even now, years later, I find myself hesitating as I open my lunchbox, my eyes scanning the contents with a wary gaze. The memory of the cafeteria's unnerving presence remains, a lingering fear that cannot be shaken, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved.